The Galactic Council's Emergency Response Committee had met 17 times since the colony collapse. 17 times, they had failed to solve the same problem. Commissioner sat at the head of the great circular table, his crystalline body dimming with frustration as he reviewed the reports once again. The numbers did not make sense. The death toll from the collapse had been 43,000. Terrible, yes, but manageable for a species that numbered in the billions. They had lost colonies before. They had rebuilt before. But this time, something was different. This time, the survivors were dying too. Not from injuries, not from disease. They were simply stopping, ceasing to function, refusing to eat, refusing to move. The medical corps had scanned their bodies 1,000 times and found nothing wrong. Their organs worked. Their neural pathways were intact. But they lay in their beds and stared at walls, and slowly, quietly, they faded away. The committee had tried everything. They had sent the finest doctors from 12 different species. They had offered neural, chemical rebalancing, memory suppression. The Axiom Collective had even proposed a full consciousness transfer, moving the survivors into new bodies free from whatever contamination was affecting them. Nothing worked. They kept dying, and no one could explain why. It was during the 18th session that the human ambassador asked to speak. Was not an impressive figure by galactic standards. She was small and soft, made of carbon and water like all her kind. She had no crystalline facets no bioluminescent tendrils like the delegation, no quantum processing cores like the Axiom representatives. She was simply human, a member of a species that had only discovered faster-than-light travel 3 centuries ago. But when she stood and walked to the center of the chamber, something in her bearing made the delegates fall silent. "I have listened to these proceedings for many months," said. Her voice was calm and clear. "I have heard brilliant minds propose brilliant solutions, but I believe you are trying to solve the wrong problem." Facets flickered with confusion. "Ambassador, the problem is clear. The survivors are dying from an unknown cause." "No," said. "The cause is not unknown. You simply do not recognize it because your species have never experienced it." She paused and looked around the chamber at the assembled beings. Some were made of light. Some were made of metal. Some existed as patterns of energy or vast collective consciousnesses. They represented civilizations millions of years old, species that had conquered death itself, beings that had transcended the limitations of physical form. "The survivors are dying of grief," said. The chamber erupted in confused murmurs. The translator system struggled to convey the concept. Several species requested clarification on the term. The delegates' tendrils curled in what might have been skepticism. "Grief is not a cause of death," said the Axiom representative, a shimmering holographic form that spoke for the collective. "Grief is an emotional state. Emotional states do not kill." "Among humans they can," replied. "We have documented cases throughout our history. We call it dying of a broken heart. It happens when someone loses something so important that their will to live simply stops." She walked slowly around the chamber as she spoke, meeting the eyes of each delegate in turn. They lost more than 43,000 people in that collapse. They lost children. They lost parents. They lost mates they had bonded with for centuries. And they have no idea how to carry that loss because your medical teams keep trying to take it away from them. Leaned forward. "You are suggesting we should not try to help them." "I am suggesting you are helping them the wrong way." Stopped in the center of the chamber again. "You keep trying to cure their grief, but grief is not a disease. It is not a malfunction. It is the natural response to terrible loss, and the only way through it is through it." The Axiom representative processed this for several seconds. "We do not understand. If grief causes death, then removing grief should prevent death. This is logical." "Logic does not apply to grief," said. "That is what you must understand. Grief is not logical, it is not efficient, it cannot be optimized or streamlined. It must be felt, it must be expressed, it must be shared, and it takes time. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes a lifetime. But if you try to suppress it, if you try to erase it, you do not save the person. You simply kill them in a different way. She took a deep breath before continuing. My species has been practicing grief since before we discovered fire. We have buried our children in shallow graves for 100,000 years. We have wept over lost loves and fallen friends since the first humans walked across the African savanna. And in all that time, we have learned one thing. His voice softened, but it carried to every corner of the vast chamber. There is no cure for grief. There is no technology that can erase it, no medicine that can heal it, no procedure that can remove it. The only thing you can do is survive it, and the only way to survive it is to not be alone. The chamber was utterly silent. Even the energy beings had stopped their constant, subtle movements. Every delegate was focused entirely on the small human woman standing in their midst. "What are you proposing?" asked finally. "Send me to the survivors," said. "Not as a doctor, not as a scientist. Send me as someone who understands what they are going through. Let me sit with them. Let me listen to them. Let me show them that their pain is not a malfunction, but a testament to how much they loved what they lost. And this will save them." Was quiet for a moment. Some of them, not all. Grief does kill, and some wounds are too deep to survive. But for the others, for those who can be saved, they need someone who understands. They need someone who can show them that it is possible to hurt this much and still keep living. The Axiom representative spoke again. "You speak as if humans have unique expertise in suffering." "We do," said simply. "Not because we are special, but because we are unlucky. Our species has experienced more tragedy in our short existence than most civilizations encounter in 1,000,000 years. We have survived plagues that killed half our population. We have fought wars that burned entire cities to ash. We have watched our children die of diseases we could not cure, buried our loved ones in soil that we knew would be poisoned by the very industries keeping us alive." She spread her hands, a gesture of offering. "And yet we are still here. We wake up every morning. We plant gardens and raise children and fall in love, knowing that all of it will end in loss. We do this not because we are brave or noble, but because we have learned that this is the only way to live, to hold both the joy and the grief together, to carry the weight of loss without being crushed by it." Commissioner's crystalline form brightened slightly as he processed her words. "You are saying that humans are experts at survival not despite your suffering, but because of it." "Yes," said. "We have been practicing tragedy for so long that we have developed tools for surviving it. Rituals, traditions, ways of coming together to share the burden. We call them funerals, memorials, wakes, vigils. They serve no practical purpose. They do not bring back the dead, but they help the living keep living." The Axiom representative posed one final question, and it was the question that would change everything. "You have no cure for this suffering, and yet your species persists. How?" Smiled sadly. "We persist because we have each other, because when one of us falls into the darkness of grief, the others reach down and hold them until they can stand again. Because we know that suffering shared is suffering halved. And because we understand in a way that perhaps no other species does that some wounds never heal. They simply become part of you, and you learn to carry them." The vote was called the next morning. The motion passed unanimously. Humanity would be invited to join the Universal Tragedy Protocols, not as doctors or scientists, but as something the galaxy had never needed before: grief counselors. Return to Earth with the news. Within a year, the first training program had been established. Within 2 years, the first graduates were deploying to disaster sites across the galaxy. And within 5 years, everything had changed. The graduation ceremony took place on Luna, in a great domed auditorium that looked out over the Earth. 200 humans sat in the curved seats, wearing the simple gray uniforms of the Interstellar Trauma Response Corps. They ranged in age from 25 to 70. Some were former therapists. Some were former soldiers. Some were simply people who had survived great losses and wanted to help others do the same. Now serving as director of the program, stood at the podium and looked out at them with pride. "You are about to go out into the galaxy," she said, "and you will see things that no human has ever seen before, species you cannot imagine, cultures you do not understand, forms of life so different from your own that you will wonder if you have anything in common at all." She paused and let her words settle over the assembled graduates. "But you do have something in common. You have suffering. Every sentient being in this galaxy knows what it is to lose something precious. Every consciousness that has ever existed understands the weight of grief, even if they do not know how to carry it. That is where you come in." The first assignments went out that afternoon. Some graduates were sent to space stations, some to colony worlds, some to generation ships that had been traveling for centuries, their crews isolated and alone in the void between stars. James received his assignment 3 days later. He was to report to Molokai Station, a trading post on the edge of territory. The had suffered a hyperspace accident 11 years ago, and an entire generation ship had been lost in the void, cut off from all communication. When rescue finally arrived, they found the survivors alive but changed. Something had broken inside them during those long years of isolation. James arrived at Molokai Station on a transport ship filled with medical supplies. The station was massive, a sprawling complex of interconnected domes and tunnels that housed nearly 1 million. But as James walked through the corridors, he noticed something strange. Everything was quiet, too quiet. There were builders. It was the core of their identity, the thing that made them who they were. They expressed love through architecture, devotion through construction, grief through tearing down and rebuilding. A hive should have been filled with the constant sounds of work, the clicking of mandibles, the scraping of tools against metal and stone. But Molokai Station was silent. James met with the station administrator, a named Chitter who spoke through a translator device mounted on her thorax. She explained the situation in flat, mechanical tones. The survivors of the hyperspace accident had returned to the station. They had been given housing. They had been given food. They had been given everything they needed to resume their lives. But they did not build. They did not create. They sat in empty rooms and stared at walls, their mandibles still, their limbs unmoving. The medical teams had examined them 1,000 times and found nothing wrong. But something was wrong. Something was deeply, terribly wrong. "How many?" James asked. 37,000 survivors, Chitter replied. "Of those, approximately 12,000 have ceased all productive activity. Another 8,000 have refused nutrition. In the past month, we have lost 412 to voluntary cessation of life functions." James closed his eyes. The numbers were familiar. This was the same thing that had happened to the same quiet dying, the same confusion from the authorities who did not understand what was happening. "Take me to them," he said. Chitter led him through the station to a section that had been designated as a recovery ward. It was a vast open space, designed to allow the room to build. But instead of construction materials and half-finished projects, James saw only beds. Rows upon rows of beds, each one occupied by a still, silent form. He walked among them, looking at the unmoving. Their compound eyes were open but unfocused. Their limbs were curled against their bodies. They did not acknowledge his presence. James stopped beside one bed and knelt down. The lying there was smaller than the others, younger perhaps. Her carapace was dull, lacking the healthy sheen that James had seen on the administrators. "Hello," he said softly. "My name is James. I am here to help." There was no response. They did not move, did not blink, gave no sign that she had heard him at all. James did not try again. He simply sat down on the floor beside her bed and waited. Hours passed. Chitter came to check on him, confused by his inactivity. Other medical staff walked by, casting curious glances at the humans sitting motionless in the middle of the ward. But James did not move. He sat and breathed and waited. Eventually, as the station's lights dimmed to simulate evening, the young turned her head slightly. Her compound eyes focused on James for the first time. "You are still here," she said through her translator. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Yes," James replied, "I am still here." "Why?" James thought about the question for a long moment. "Because I know what you are going through," he said finally. "Not exactly. I am human and you are, and our minds work differently. But I know what it is to lose something so important that you cannot imagine going on. I know what it is to feel like the world has ended and you are the only one who noticed." There was silence for a long time. Then she asked, "What did you lose?" James told her about his grandmother. He told her about the war that had taken 3 of her sons, one by one, over the course of 6 terrible years. He told her how his grandmother had stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped caring about the world. How everyone had expected her to die, just like they were dying now. But she had not died. One spring morning she had walked outside and planted her garden, not because she was better, not because she had forgotten her sons, but because the ground needed tending and she was still alive to tend it. She used to say that grief was not a wall, James continued. It was a river. You cannot dam it forever. If you try, it will build up and build up until it breaks through and destroys everything. But if you let it flow, if you give it somewhere to go, it becomes something you can live with. The young considered this. We do not understand rivers. Ours has no flowing water. James nodded. Then think of it this way: grief is pressure, and pressure must be expressed or the structure will fail. You are builders. You understand that, do you not? A structure that cannot release pressure will collapse. A being that cannot release grief will do the same. Something flickered in his eyes. It was small, barely noticeable, but James saw it. A spark of recognition, a moment of connection. "We built during the years in the void," she said slowly. "We built constantly. It was the only thing that kept us alive. We built because building meant we were still ourselves, still connected to everything we had lost. And now—" Her eyes dimmed again. "Now there is nothing to build. We have returned to our people. We have everything we need, but we do not need buildings. We need. She could not finish the sentence. She did not have the words in her language or in any language for what she needed. But James understood. She did not need buildings. She needed meaning. She needed a way to express the weight of 11 years of isolation and fear and loss. She needed to take the grief that was crushing her and turn it into something outside herself. "What if you built something that was not for need?" James asked. "What if you built something simply to remember?" They looked at him in confusion. "We do not understand. All building has purpose. All construction serves function." "Not among my people," James said. "We build things with no purpose except to remember. We call them memorials. They do not shelter us. They do not feed us. They do not serve any practical function at all. They exist only to say, this happened, this mattered, this loss was real." He could see her processing this idea. It was foreign to her, alien to everything her species understood about construction. But it was also exactly what she needed. "Would you like to try?" James asked. "I will help you. We can build something small, something just for you, something to hold the memory of what you lost." The young was silent for a very long time. Then, slowly, painfully, she uncurled her limbs and pushed herself upright. "Yes," she whispered, "I would like to try." 1 month later, the first new structure rose on Molokai Station. It was small, barely taller than James himself. It was impractical, serving no function that anyone could identify. It stood in the center of the recovery ward, and those who looked at it could not say why it mattered. But the who built it could say. She had worked on it for 3 weeks, pouring everything she could not express into the arrangement of metal and stone. Every angle held a memory. Every joint held a loss. When she finished, She sat before it for an entire day, motionless, her compound eyes reflecting the structure she had created. Then she went to the communal dining hall and ate for the first time in months. The idea spread. Other survivors began to build. Not homes, not tools, not anything useful. They built memory shapes, grief structures, monuments to the years they had spent lost in the void. Some were small enough to hold in one hand. Others grew to fill entire rooms. None of them served any practical purpose, and all of them were precious beyond measure. By the end of the year, the death rate among the survivors had dropped by 80%. The medical team still did not understand exactly what had changed, but James understood. He sent his report back to Earth with a single recommendation. They did not need medicine. They did not need therapy. They needed what all grieving beings needed, a way to carry their loss without being crushed by it, a way to transform their grief into something they could hold and look at and share with others. They needed memorials, and they needed someone to show them how to build them. The report made its way through the council's bureaucracy and eventually reached Commissioner. He read it 3 times, his crystalline facets brightening with each reading. Here, finally, was proof that had been right. The humans understood something about suffering that the rest of the galaxy had never grasped. Drafted the proposal that same evening. It was radical, unprecedented, almost absurd in its simplicity. The Universal Tragedy Protocols would be amended. A new category of responder would be added to the standard disaster response teams. Not doctors, not engineers, not logistics specialists. Counselors, human grief counselors. The formal amendment to the Universal Tragedy Protocols took 5 years to pass. It required the approval of 412 member species, each with their own concerns and objections. Some species worried that humans were too young, too primitive, too emotionally unstable to be trusted with such important work. Others questioned whether human psychological frameworks could translate across the vast differences between species. But as the years passed, the evidence mounted. On Molokai Station, the survivors had rebuilt their lives. On Prime, the death rate among colony collapse survivors had dropped to nearly 0. On a dozen other worlds, human counselors had achieved results that no one else had been able to replicate. The final vote was held on a space station orbiting a neutral world, in a chamber large enough to hold representatives from every member species. Now in her 70s, watched from the gallery as the votes were cast. 412 in favor, 0 opposed. The Universal Tragedy Protocols now included human counselors. The ambassador rose to speak. She was weeping openly, tears streaming down her face in a display that would have been unthinkable for her species 5 years ago. She had learned the behavior from a human counselor. Her people called it release of weight. My species believed that happiness was the natural state, she said, her voice thick with emotion. We believed that suffering was an aberration to be eliminated. When tragedy struck, we tried to cure it like a disease. We tried to erase it like a system error. And our people died because we did not understand. She turned to look at the human delegation, at sitting in the gallery, at the 100 counselors who had traveled from Earth to witness this moment. The humans taught us otherwise. They showed us that suffering is woven into existence itself. It cannot be eliminated. It cannot be optimized away. It can only be carried. And the species that thrive are not those who avoid suffering, but those who have learned to carry it together. The ambassador's voice broke, but she continued. I have watched your counselors work. I have seen them sit with grieving beings who do not look like them, do not think like them, cannot even speak the same language. I have seen them perform the oldest human ritual, simply being present in the presence of pain. And I have seen miracles happen, not medical miracles, not technological miracles, the simple miracle of one being helping another survive. She turned back to face the assembled delegates. We owe humanity a debt we cannot repay, not for technology, not for trade, for something far more precious. They have given us the gift of grief. They have taught us how to suffer, and in doing so, they have taught us how to live. Did not speak during the ceremony. She sat in the gallery and listened, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm and peaceful. When the vote was announced, when the cheers and celebrations began, she allowed herself a small smile. She was thinking of James and his work on Molokai Station. She was thinking of the young who had built a memorial to her lost years. She was thinking of her own losses, her husband who had died decades ago, her daughter who had followed him, the countless small griefs that had accumulated across a lifetime. She had given the galaxy many things in her long career, speeches and proposals and diplomatic victories. But this, she knew, was her truest contribution, not words or policies, but understanding. The understanding that it was possible to hurt terribly, to lose everything that mattered, and still find reason to wake the next morning. Somewhere across the galaxy, a human counselor was sitting with a grieving being of a species she had never encountered, in a language she barely spoke. She was not fixing anything. She was not curing anything. She was simply there, present, available, ready to catch whoever needed catching. It was, the galaxy had come to understand, the most human thing there was. The lights in the chamber dimmed as the ceremony concluded. Delegates began to file out, returning to their ships and there, but remained in her seat, looking out at the stars through the great windows. James had sent her a message that morning. They were building again, not just memorials now, but homes and schools and community centers. They had found their purpose again. They had learned to carry their grief and keep living. It had taken 11 years of suffering and 2 years of counseling, but they had made it. They had survived. And now they would pass on what they had learned to others of their kind, spreading the knowledge that grief was not the end of everything, but simply part of the journey. Closed her eyes and let herself feel, for just a moment, the weight of all the years she had carried. The losses, the victories, the long, slow work of teaching an entire galaxy that suffering was not a failure to be corrected, but a testament to how deeply life could matter. When she opened her eyes again, she was smiling. The stars were still shining. The galaxy was still turning. And somewhere out there, someone who had thought they would never feel whole again was learning to build their first memorial. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.